In this video, we're going to reinstall the exhaust manifold and the new upgraded turbocharger on my Caterpillar 3126B. Stay tuned. So I've started cleaning up the exhaust manifold before I go ahead and reinstall it in the RV. As you can see, I've started cleaning up the flanges here. I'm partway through. You can see most of them kind of look like this, where you see some more erosion around here, and this is enough that my fingernail can catch on it. And I'm trying to get it smoother, kind of like this, like the others, to try to prevent the possibility of leaks. Basically, I'm calling 4 out of the 6 done so far. You got a couple little spots here, but nothing significant. I might try to touch them up a little bit more. What I've been doing is I've just been using my wire wheel on my grinder. That way it's not actually being an abrasive thing that's going to mess up the flatness. This should just be removing some of this top part, which I think may really be some leftover gasket and things like that, because it's coming off and creating the nice surface here. So I'm gonna get back to cleaning this up some more. Well, that took a lot of time on the grinder. I'm back over here at the mill, and one thing I wanted to point out, there's no wobble, maybe just a little bit this direction, but there's no wobble fore to aft in the manifold if I have it here on the mill. Went through to see if I could get a feeler gauge under these, and there's nothing, none of the cylinders look like they'll give me any issues. And if you take a look here versus before, you can see how much cleaner, especially these two middle cylinders are, the outer ones. I touched up a couple of areas, but this should be a nice smooth surface for me to be able to not worry about exhaust leaks putting this back in. Okay, so why would I want to wrap my exhaust manifold in header wrap? The whole idea behind header wrap is that it is supposed to keep the heat in the exhaust and not have it go into the engine bay. So when you've got a turbocharged application, the theory behind this is that heat is energy, and if the temperature of the exhaust before the turbo goes down, that means that you are basically giving away energy that could be used to spool the turbo. So the theory is that you're going to have less turbo lag if you wrap your exhaust. The effect of this is going to be pretty minor. There wasn't much turbo lag on this before, and the new turbo is better all around since it's an upgrade. I'm not worried about turbo lag. The bigger thing I'm going after with it is that being a rear radiator bus, all of the cooling air that goes through the intercooler and the radiator has to go through the engine bay first. Well, if you've got this big 1,000-degree piece of cast iron sitting there, that's going to heat up the air that goes by it on its way to the intercooler and the radiator. And while I don't have overheating issues, it's something that is not going to help you. When I wrapped the rest of the exhaust, I didn't bother doing the manifold because there really wasn't a good way to get at all of it, and I figured it wasn't worth the effort. But while I have it here, it's pretty easy, so I'm just going to go ahead and get this done. If you've never worked with header wrap before, good idea to wear a respirator and gloves. This will make you very itchy. So let's get to it. Alright, well, I didn't get as much of this covered up as I was hoping to. It was getting to where I was having a hard time getting the header wrap covering this center section without it blocking the holes for the bolts, and I didn't want anything interfering there because that's all got to clamp well. So this is good enough. It gets a little bit of, it's going to stop some of the heat, and that's what I'm going for. So I'd say now it's about time to get ready to start putting the thing back in the bus. Alright, so whenever you're putting a turbo in, you want to make sure that your ports are aligned properly. And when I say that, what I'm really talking about are your compressor outlet relative to the core, oil supply, and oil drain, and then also your turbine side outlet. All of these need to be lined up properly to make sure everything is going where it's supposed to. The instructions for my new turbo say that your oil drain should be within 20 degrees of vertical. But in the case of the 3126 that this is going back on, the oil drain, and I'll show you how this works here, it's actually a two-piece drain. So you've got this hard tube that bolts to the bottom of the turbo, and then that has an O-ring here which goes into this little adapter that bolts to the block. Incidentally, Cat only gave me the one O-ring, so I need to get the other one as well before this goes in. So adjusting is not difficult to do at all, at least on a new turbo. If I were to try to loosen these bolts here, that would be pretty bad. But I'll just put this way to make it easy for me to reference. So around the turbo, around the compressor housing, you've got these bolts, which should come tightened, but you should check that anyway. And then all you need to do is loosen them. You don't need to take them all out, probably better not to. And I've gone through and I've done that. Once that's done, the housing should rotate pretty easily. I just want to make sure I'm doing this gently, and as you can see, no effort at all. The compressor outlet, I can pretty much eyeball that one because that's got a flex coupling up here, so that does not need to be super perfect. But this, if you look at it, on the old one, compressor was more or less in line with the oil supply, a little bit further back. So that should be about right. So I'm going to go through, tighten those, and then what my general procedure I think will be is I'm going to leave the turbo drain, or leave the wastegate and the turbo drain off, because without the wastegate actuator on, I should be able to actually reach the drain bolts just fine to get that in place, and then I can get this on. So alright, we'll tighten these down, loosen the other side up, and get it pretty close. Alright, so I was looking at my turbos here, both the new one and the old one. I went through and I loosened up the bolts for the turbine housing on the old one. By the way, if you buy a turbo, even if you're going to bolt it on, make sure that the bolts are tight. These were not very tight. I do not blame the manufacturer at all for that, because they ship it to you knowing that you're going to have to clock it to the correct position. But just make sure beforehand, just to make sure that everything's going to be good. So if you look at these turbos, and remember these are both S300s, everything is, should be pretty close. You can see that the wastegate housing here has these bolts, and if you flip the turbo on those bolts, that actually provides you with a level surface. And if you have an iPhone, one of the built-in features is the ability to measure angles. So if you have it leveled and you have it and you put the phone up, it will give you an angle. So this is 36 degrees, and if I clock, and this is the oil inlet side, it really shouldn't matter whether you use the oil inlet side or the oil drain side, because those are directly 180 degrees opposite of one another. But I'm going to do that, and if I'm convinced that I did that it gets me close enough, then I'll tighten down the bolts and kind of gamble a little bit that if it's off half a degree, that really shouldn't be a problem. So I'm going to give that a shot. see how it works, and then the turbo itself should be ready to install. I'm still going to opt to not put on the wastegate actuator until after the turbo is installed, I think, and I'm going to do that after I get the after I put the oil drain on, just to make sure that all of that is correct. So on mine, the wastegate has the little C-clip on here, so probably a good idea to pull that off if you're going to do that first, just so you don't have to try to pull it off with it in a bad position. So let's clock it. I'm ready to put the manifold back on. So big thing when you're doing this is make sure that you have everything lined up and oriented properly. When I took this off, the number 1 cylinder, which is this one over here, needed the bolts to be in it. I couldn't take the bolts out while putting the manifold in. So what that means is I need to have stuff basically in as I'm trying to maneuver the manifold into position. And so I've got my new lock tabs, whatever you want to call them, new bolts. I have to put anti-seize on the ends of the bolt, and then the other thing is the gasket, of course, can't forget that. Cat doesn't call this out, but I'm going to use some of this spray-on gasket, the copper specifically. Make sure it's the copper kind. So you can put this on exhaust manifolds to try to help seal it a little bit better. Not necessarily required, but I think in this case I'm going to give it a shot. So just needs a little spray on each side of the gasket material. So let's see if I can figure out how to make this work. Well, that was not particularly fun or fast, but it's in and it's all torqued down. So just a couple of things that I'll note. So again, for me, the number 1 cylinder up there needed to have actually only one of the bolts. It was the lower bolt, which is the furthest forward through the manifold before. And that also means that the appropriate little crossover lock tab needed to be in there as well. So first I tried putting it in with the gasket in as well. That really did not work at all. So instead I just put the bolt in, put the manifold in place, and then I started off with the center bolts, just getting them started threaded with the gaskets in place, and then worked my way outward, and then that worked. Caterpillar has a 2-step torque sequence, basically going in a circular pattern and then further outward. From that, first step is about 4 foot-pounds, and then the second one is 36 foot-pounds. Check your manual to make sure that that's accurate for your engine, but that's what it was for me. And now everything is on. Just doing another last check, and I think everything looks like it's in good shape. Hopefully I got all these gaskets on appropriately. You know, the nice thing is Caterpillar does have a good setup with how the clamping force is, having these bolts out here as part of the casting, and then putting all of the force between the manifold and the head through these flanges is really a good setup for trying to keep everything sealed. So I'm going to do one more look over to make sure it looks like everything's good. Then I'm going to go through and I'm going to hit all these lock tabs to make sure that they are working, or that they're in place, and then it'll be time to throw in the turbo. Well, to my surprise, I actually managed to get something on all of these little lock tabs, even that forwardmost bolt on the number 1 cylinder. So all of that is set up. I'm going through now and just checking out to see if there's anything I should address before putting the turbo in. Looks like there's a little bit. One of the alternator bolts is loose for my lower alternator, and then on the upper alternator I probably should trim that bolt, that lower bolt there, because that was pretty close to the air inlet before, and since this turbo is just a hair larger, it may push it just a bit closer. So go trim up a couple of things, and then I'll be ready for the turbo. All right, well, I'm starting to get the turbo in, and this was kind of an odd one. For some reason, and I hadn't noticed this, these top 2 bolt holes were threaded and the bottom two were not. I'm guessing this must have to do with a particular application, or else it was just a mistake or an oversight. Of course, I figured this out once I started getting the thing in, but I was able to maneuver the turbo around, made sure everything was properly covered up, and got the two holes drilled out. All right, let's try this again. Putting it in is a lot harder than removing it. Well, that was a lot of not fun, but I got it in. As you would expect, whenever you're putting in something bigger than what was in there, it makes things a little bit harder. Big thing was really actually the same bolt that was difficult before, which was the bottom bolt on the front of the engine, rear of the bus. That one, you kind of have to get in a cavity just underneath the compressor, and it would be a lot easier if you didn't have to deal with the limitations on access from the bedroom. But got it in, got it torqued down. So things that I noted: the boot that goes onto the compressor side of the turbo, that's fine. I did need to shave off that bit of the bolt off of the alternator, so that's no problem. It also clears that tube which goes down to the water pump, so that's fine. Area where I do have an issue though is on this tube relative to the exhaust brake. So right over here, the exhaust brake hits this. Now what this tube is the tube for the dipstick for the transmission, and that includes, that's also how you fill it. That tube has caused me some problems with access before. It doesn't need to be very far off, moved very far, but it does need to be moved just a bit. So I will, I'll have to deal with that before I can bolt up the back side of the exhaust. So next thing is going to be putting on the drain tube and making sure that that works. I already know I'm going to have to get a hose or something made up for the oil supply. And now I know what size I need to order for a silicone boost elbow to go from the turbo over to the outlet pipe that goes to the intercooler. So gotta order that and just keep on moving forward. All right, progress. Got my new boost elbow from Amazon. That's on. Got the turbo hooked up to the exhaust. I'd had some interference over here where the exhaust brake actuator was hitting the transmission dipstick tube. And then I realized this is on V-band clamps, I can rotate it. So I just loosened the clamp on the back side and rotated it a little bit out of the way. As you can see, there's still plenty of room here. And got the new V-band clamp on the end of the turbo. Before I did that, I took the little plug I've got off of the turbo oil inlet and I fed some oil into the bearings, which you're supposed to do. I just used a little squirt can. And then I reached into the exhaust side of the turbo and spun the wheel a little bit to make sure that everything was still going well. And actually it you could tell that the oil was in there because when I let go it kept on spinning for several seconds, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. So that is all good stuff. Maybe I should have tried to put the turbo oil drain on first to make sure everything was aligned properly, but actually I guess that doesn't matter because if there is an issue I'll have to rotate things up front here. But I think it'll be fine. And also I've got the compressor boot, or the boot going to the inlet of the compressor, that's tightened on. So really the next things are going to be putting on the turbo oil drain and then the wastegate actuator. And then up here is where that port is for the wastegate actuator, so I'll have to run the hose up to that. So, all right, let's keep going. Okay, so I went to go test fit the drain pipe and everything looks like it's fitting just fine. AGP sent a drain gasket. I'm going to use the cat gasket that I bought just because it does fit, and whenever possible I try to use the Caterpillar gaskets just because I know that they're good quality. But there was just one area that I want to point out. Turbo drain bolts that go into the center section. on the new turbo. AGP includes those. So they do not fit through the stock holes. You got to just drill them out a little bit. 3/8 inch drill bit. So I did this side. That one's fine. Got to do the other one, and then I can put it in. Alright, I found one more difference between the old turbo and the new turbo, and that's specifically with the wastegate actuator that AGP included. So if you look carefully, you don't even have to look that carefully, you can see that there's a decent height difference here, maybe 3/4 of an inch or so. And the problem with this is that when you have the drain tube in place that Caterpillar provides, it's hitting the new actuator. So Caterpillar does not sell the actuator separately. I already called them and asked, so I'm gonna try to get this thing off and see what I can do with it. But I got the bolts that hold the bracket onto the turbo off. To my surprise, only one of them broke. The other two came off, although I did spray them with some Croil first. But in case there were any doubts, this turbo the wastegate is completely seized. This should be moving up and down freely. It is not moving at all. So it's completely seized in place. So I've definitely found a very probable root cause of my overboosting condition that I was having. You need a wastegate that functions. So whether this was always seized or it's seized somewhere in my ownership, who knows? But now I got to try to get this stupid thing off. So let's see what I can do. Alright, it's probably going to take me a few days to get this wastegate issue sorted out, but I decided that it's probably a good idea to go ahead and run it and do a leak check, just because I want to make sure everything seems okay on the turbo, and not having the wastegate functioning isn't going to hurt anything for that. So go ahead and start things. Everything above looks good. Air pressure is starting to come up. Let's see, good oil pressure. Air pressure built up surprisingly quickly, actually. Although then again, part of that's probably because the airbags are empty, and with the thing up on the jacks, it's not going to try to air them up because it's going to be trying to dump that air. So, but still, that's good that it built so quickly. So, alright, well, I'll call this part a success, and now I got to get a wastegate actuator. I realized when I started editing that I didn't get any video of the wastegate actuator that AGP sent, but they did send an adjustable actuator that I was able to attach to the stock bracket and put on the turbo. Alright, well that really sucked. And I've got the old turbo here because this will be easier to explain why. So what I just finished doing was getting the wastegate actuator onto the new turbo. So there's a few things that make this difficult. First off, the actuator is having to pull the wastegate shut. That's how it holds it shut, so that you don't get exhaust gas is bypassing the turbine side. So when you're doing that, so when it's holding this shut, you're having to pull against the spring, which is pretty hard, to get these bolts started. And keep in mind that until it's tightened, well, and when it's tightened too, it's trying to pull the whole actuator assembly and bracket back down. So once you get the first one in, the second bolt is not so hard. What took me a long time to get was this third bolt, because it's trying to pull the bracket in such a way that the threads don't really line up with the hole. What worked for me to make this happen, and this was still difficult, was I snugged these two bolts down enough that it was tight enough that I could still move the bracket around with a couple of taps of a hammer, but not enough that the spring pressure by itself would move it around. And it took me a while, but doing that I was able to then get everything lined up enough to where this third bolt went in. Keep in mind that when I was doing this, and I'll get under the bus to show you in a minute, the drain tube is in here, which makes access to this really difficult in general. So there is really not a good way to get to work in here. Like I was showing you just a minute ago, no matter how you look at it, these bolts are kind of difficult to get at. You have to also get this arm on the wastegate, which you really have to do first. This arm doesn't really want to bend a whole lot, and it is a tight fit onto the wastegate right there. So I finally got it in. My recommendation, if you are doing this and you're using the exact same parts that I did, put the wastegate actuator and the drain tube on the turbo before you try to put it into the onto your engine. Especially if you have a helper. I think if I had a helper who could have been under here to help line everything up and provide some support while I was trying to get those bolts on to those nuts onto the manifold, that would have made all the difference in the world. Well, and with that, my installation is complete. I got the boost reference hose going from the compressor side of the turbo to the wastegate actuator. If I ended up setting the actuator incorrectly, then I'll probably add an electronic boost controller rather than try to take this off again with how much of a pain it was to take off and adjust. You can see I put the wrap around the turbine side of the turbo, and with this everything's done. So this video ran a little bit longer than I was expecting, but there was a lot of work involved with it. I'm going to do a follow-up video that discusses the performance and how happy I am with this once I drive it. But everything that you saw here is relevant if you've got a stock replacement as well. Just maybe delete a couple of extra steps that I had to do, but really this is pretty much a bolt-in. So thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this and found it useful. Make sure to put any questions or comments down in the comments below, and stay tuned for the next video that'll show what I think of driving it.